Hello, my name is Rebecca Fay and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Natural Capital Partners. For those of you that don't know us, we work with corporations all over the world to ensure they meet their emission reduction and renewable energy goals, and we specialise in environmental instruments, whether that's carbon offsetting or energy attribute certificates in the form of renewable energy certificates and guarantees of origin. As you all know, COP24 kicked off yesterday with David Attenborough wheeled in to inspire everyone to make some meaningful progress on the commitments made in Paris. We don't have David Attenborough here today, but I'm optimistic that our two speakers will give you a valuable insight into what these global climate negotiations might mean for private sector climate action. Our first speaker is Jonathan Shopley. Jonathan leads Natural Capital Partners' contribution to policy developments on climate change. He's on the board of the International Emissions Trading Organization, otherwise known as IETA, and he's a veteran attendee at COPs. And Chris Webb, who is Senior Policy Advisor at the Nature Conservancy, which is the world's largest conservation organization, and Chris runs climate change for their European program. Thank you very much for joining us, and the webinar will last about 45 minutes and we will leave around 10 minutes at the end for questions. You are all muted and in listen-only modes, so please use the panel on the right-hand side of your screen to submit your questions, and as I said, we will leave plenty of time to go through those at the end. Before we begin, we would like to just run a quick audience poll to gauge the current view of all of you. Please, can you respond to the question, which you should see on the screen now? So what we're asking you is, which one of these goals that the Paris Agreement has set do you find the most compelling? So please select one of those goals: 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, net zero emissions by the second half of this century, unlocking low carbon finance, increasing the ability to adapt to climate change. Which of those do you find the most compelling? And with that, I think we've probably got the results in. And looking at that, net zero by the second half of this century is by quite some way the lead in terms of what do you find the most compelling. That's good. We like to hear that. So with that, I'm now very pleased to hand over to Jonathan, who's going to give us an overview of the COP negotiations and what the UNFCCC can do to unlock more action. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everybody. It's a mixed pleasure to be telling you about Katowice, because it's bound to be a COP that is cool, in the heart of, located as it is in the heart of Poland's coal mining district. But this whole story that leads up to Katowice began in 1990 with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's first report on the science of climate change. And today, if you squint a bit, you can see that we've had 30 years of action or policy making since we started off the back of that report to develop a global response to a global issue. As we mentioned in that poll, we have until mid-century 2050 to get to net zero global economy. So we've got another 30 years ahead of us. Now, to break that down, that timeline down a little bit into what we call the Kyoto era and the Paris era. Kyoto was the first response to that IPCC report. The protocol was adopted in '97, ratified and came into force in 2005. But in 2001, there was a COP in Marrakesh, which developed the Marrakesh Accords, and that's the equivalent to what we have coming up in Katowice. In other words, this is the COP that will translate the agreement into and support it with some operating procedures and give us the rule book that helps us implement it. As you probably know, the Kyoto Protocol ran out in 2012, was extended until the end of 2020. So this new Paris era will begin properly on the 1st of January 2021. But we entered into the Paris era early on, probably when those negotiations in Copenhagen failed to deliver the successor to the Kyoto Protocol in 2013, and we kicked the can down the road a little bit to Paris, and that was a great success and a tremendous improvement on what we had in Kyoto, in the sense that every country, just about every country, now has a target. And so Katowice is going to develop the rule book, we hope, and then there will be a stock take in 2023 and one every 5 years after that. The remarkable thing, of course, about the Paris Agreement is that it is largely voluntary. Countries are invited to develop a plan on a voluntary basis. About the only real requirement under the Paris Agreement right now is a regular reporting on progress against those targets and a tightening up, a ratcheting of those up, so that we all get onto a net zero path in due course. So it's complicated for a number of reasons, you might ask, what's complicated about an agreement which is 16 pages, depending on what font you print it out in, 29 articles. What's complicated about getting that into the Paris Rulebook? There are a number of things that make it a bit complicated. Article 2, which speaks about a 2-degree target. We've already polled views on that. The IPCC's most recent report recommending that we aim for 1.5 and net zero by 2050, not in the second half of the century. Article 4, which talks about net zero, a balance between emissions and reductions, and how the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions, the targets that each country has, contributes to those, and how they need to ratchet up over time, because there is a gap between the NDCs as they are now and a stable trajectory to even 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. Article 5, which, Chris, I know you're going to be picking up on, deals with forests and what I think TNC and others are calling natural climate solutions and the importance of those. And for us, as a contributor, as an agent of carbon neutrality or net zero, market-based instruments are very important, and Article 6 deals with those, and Article 13, a very critical one that gets referred to a great deal, and that's about the transparency of what individual countries are doing and what progress they're making, and how we add up the numbers in a way that compares apples with apples, and allows us to really track where we are. Closing the ambition gap on 1.5 will be a challenge, and also the Paris Agreement, which celebrated a real unity amongst all the major emitting nations, has been rocked a little by the fact that Brazil and the US have indicated their desire to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And of course, the other thing about these negotiations is nothing's done until everything's agreed. And so the complexity across all of those articles and getting them all on track is a challenge. And I haven't even mentioned the articles that deal with adaptation, loss and damage because of climate change, and finance, the real key issue that will be felt now that the US has withdrawn. So it's complicated, and it also comes at an interesting time. Rebecca, you pointed out that this webinar is going to try and extract the messages for business and corporates. And so what we are seeing is a time of seismic shift in private sector responses. And the first is a dramatic move from what has been the norm, transparency, accountability, targets, pretty much as represented by a lot of the great work that the CDP has done, the Climate Disclosure Project, as it used to be called, and a focus on getting organizations to measure and reduce their emissions. And that's shifting to strategy, transformation, and enterprise value, and well represented by the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is shifting corporates' focus from footprints to strategies to decarbonize and transform to a net zero economy by mid-century. And furthermore, sustainability has always been at central to both the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Protocol. And up until now, I feel that sustainability has been a business objective, which is sometimes somewhat removed from the core strategy of business. And over the past 5 years or more, we are seeing that change very dramatically. And sustainability is now the context for business strategy. And the global goals, which have been so critical and will remain critical to 2030, when they're due to be sort of added up and delivered, is being not so much replaced, but extended by things like the new climate economy. This is a report that talks less about the things we need to solve and replaces that with the benefits of taking early and considered action on climate change. So, for example, in their recent report, they talk about $26 trillion of savings by 2030 across the global economy if we embrace the transformation that the IPCC's reports are talking to. So, as we go into Katowice, we're also being faced with a very interesting invitation from the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which runs all of the negotiations. And 2 years ago, when Fiji first took on the leadership of the UNFCCC for a year, there was already a commitment in the Paris Agreement to a facilitated dialogue that would try and break up the concrete that that tends to characterize the negotiations, with a dialogue amongst private sector, NGOs, and government policymakers in something called the Talanoa Dialogue, which is a Fijian concept, thank you, that asks 3 questions in a very open and collaborative way. Where are we? Where do we want to go? And how are we going to get there? And the idea was to have these dialogues right across the globe for the last year. It started in, I think the first submissions were in April, a second in October, and these are going to be taken into the negotiations in Katowice. And the idea is to accelerate progress on the policy side by breaking up and getting people to better understand different stakeholder perspectives. So we saw that as an opportunity to conduct our own Talanoa dialogues. And as Rebecca mentioned, a large part of what we've done over the 20 years that we've been in business is help companies reach net zero carbon neutrality through the use of instruments. And so we made net zero the focus of our Talanoa dialogues. We did 7, 3, some in the States, some in Europe. They involved 61 companies that together represent combined revenues of $1.3 trillion. And some of the organizations, our logos are on the slide that you have in front of you, as are the locations where we held these conversations. Thank you. One of the things we did, just a sort of little aside, little anecdote, the Fijians came up with this concept of the Talanoa Dialogue, and so we went to speak to them about how they run them, and they mentioned these are very different kinds of conversations. Generally, people speak into the middle of a table, and so we asked them for some icon, something we could use, some token we could use to focus people's conversation. And the High Commissioner of Fiji had in his office the cup of the rugby sevens from the 2012 Olympics, which was won by Fiji against formidable opposition from South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. And so we used the rugby ball as our focus for our conversations because it represented what a very small nation can do. And we also remembered the fact that South Africa's transformation from apartheid to post-apartheid era was driven by a lot by people who used the sports boycott, and particularly a rugby boycott on South Africa. And of course, as soon as Mandela was out and democratic process was restored to South Africa, the South Africans won the World Rugby Cup against the reigning champs, New Zealand. Next slide. So these were very rich conversations, each of about 3 or 4 hours long, and we were left with a lot of indications from the businesses that had taken net zero or considered net zero, been involved. And our task was to create a report, a submission to the UNFCCC, which we put in October, and it covered 3 areas and 10 recommendations. They were financing net zero, accounting for net zero, and enhancing net zero. Slide. And just to quickly run through those recommendations, and this is the basis by which now I think we and those in the private sector will be able to judge the outcomes of Katowice against these 10, which represent some consensus of opinion around what the top priorities are. So operationalizing Article 6, which is the one, if you remember, that brings the market-based approaches back into play, much like the flexible mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol. Promoting drawdown approaches, in other words, a net sequestration of greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere, which of course natural climate solutions plays a very key role in. Accelerating the wind down of subsidies, which bizarrely still make up about $500 billion amongst the G8 to fossil fuels. So it seems crazy to be plotting a transformation where much of the finance is still propping up fossil fuels. And funding and empowering the Green Climate Fund, which is, it was set up through this process and is supposed to have $1 billion a year, $100 billion a year to distribute to developing economies. With the departure of the United States, that is struggling to get the money and to disperse it. For the accounting for net zero, it seemed to the group that evolving the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, into comparable reportable blueprints for net zero seemed like an obvious next step. Translating net zero into global, country and sector carbon budgets, so we know how much we can emit to 2050 to maintain certain levels of warming, and we might want to use those budgets actually and distribute them as a step forward. Encouraging sectors to develop sectoral accounting for net zero, and designing the rule book with innovative new technologies in mind. These negotiations have been going on for effectively nearly 30 years, but in the midst of a major technology transformation around digital information, artificial intelligence, and big data management. And we think that many of the participants felt that this had a critical role to play in how we design an effective transformation. And then the final group was the enhancing net zero. So the repositioning of net zero, not as an endpoint, but rather the inflection point. So getting to net zero is not really the goal. It's getting through the eye of the needle of net zero to a point where many of the risks and the restrictions of climate change get replaced by many business opportunities in a cleaner, safer world. And the Talanoa dialogue was uniformly enjoyed as a process by the people we had involved, and felt that that non-negotiating stakeholder dialogue would complement the UNFCCC's activities and should continue to do so. Thank you. So so one that takes me to the end of the slides that I wanted to cover, but now I'd like to hand over to Chris to talk a little bit about one of the toughest areas of climate policy. Climate policy, because as I mentioned, we have a lot of business opportunities in the low carbon trajectory, but much of the urgent attention needs to be on our ecosystems, which act as a critical sink. So with that, to you, Rebecca, and then on to Chris.
Thanks, Jonathan, very much for that. And I think it will be really interesting over the next couple of weeks when you have the pleasure of being in Poland to see how much that input from stakeholders through things like the Talanoa dialogues does contribute to the negotiations that go on there. We've had some questions come in already, and we'll go through those at the end. Please do keep on submitting those as we move on to Chris. Chris is going to, as Jonathan said, dive a bit deeper into what the COP might do for natural climate solutions, and he'll talk a little bit more about what natural climate solutions are. Before we do that, let's do another quick poll on this specific point, the point of natural climate solutions. You'll see it up on the screen now. So the question is, the land sector is responsible for around 25% of global emissions. What percentage of global finance, climate finance, does it receive? Do you believe it receives 30%, 3%, or 0.3%? So quite a big difference between those three, and we'll wait for you all to submit your responses to that. They're coming in now. This will be interesting to see what Chris has to say when he sees this, what sort of answer we get. And okay, interesting there. You can see that, well, no one thinks it gets 30%, but a pretty even spread between 30% and 0.3%. So with that, Chris, I'm going to hand over to you to comment on what you think that might mean. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good afternoon, and thanks to Jonathan and Rebecca and the team here at Natural Capital Partners for having me this afternoon. So thanks for responding to that quick poll. I can reveal the answer is in fact 3%, so the majority of you are right there. We perhaps were leading all of you to a somewhat low expectation, but we're going to come back to that number in a few minutes, so keep that 3% number in mind. As Rebecca mentioned, I've got a few minutes and I'm just going to do two things. One is a little bit of a deep dive around what we've seen in 2018 as a really pivotal year for countries and businesses understanding and embracing natural climate solutions. So I want to talk a little bit about what they are. I'm also then going to pivot to why this COP started already in Katowice in Sunday is really important for scaling carbon finance for conserving nature. So really the framing and backdrop to all of this is a narrative that's already been mentioned on this webinar, and I was really pleased to see so many of you responding to in that first poll question. So the narrative around needing to reach net zero really seems to have been the framing that has become mainstream within the climate community in 2018. And I think in part, the IPCC 1.5 degree report released in October had a big part to play in that. Now, net zero is really important. And one of the things that's important to understand about it is that net zero is net. It isn't gross. It requires and recognizes that there will be some residual emissions of greenhouse gases, probably into the 2050s, 60s, 70s, but that we need to balance that with carbon removal. And so the other area of the climate change challenge that has got more attention we see in 2018 has been how do we remove carbon at scale? How do we create sinks to deliver that net zero? And nature, unsurprisingly, I'm sure to all of you, is actually a carbon removal technology that has been honed over millennia and can be deployed all around the world, capturing carbon dioxide, storing it in biomass, and releasing oxygen and water. And so nature and the range of opportunities that nature provides as a climate solution, we call natural climate solutions. So it can help deliver both on the removal side and on the avoidance side of emissions. So to do so, there are I'm going to explain sort of what we mean by natural climate solutions. And really there are three strategies to have in mind. So protect what we've got, transform what we use, and restore what we used to have. And when we think about these three strategies, think about a range of ecosystems all around the world: forests, agricultural land, grasslands, peatland, wetlands, coastlands. They all have a role to play in delivering natural climate solutions as a key tool to help us delivering this net zero goal. So if these are a big opportunity, one of the questions that's really important is how big an opportunity? And the Nature Conservancy were extremely privileged to, for the past few years, lead a number of other organizations to deliver a peer-reviewed study that looked at this question. And this is where I'm going to come back to that 3%. So if you hold that 3% in your mind, and what we found was that if you focus in on what's needed between now and 2030, nature should be playing approximately 37% of the climate mitigation. Now, if you take nothing away from these few minutes, it's that number, 37% between now and 2030. And that's on a cost-effective basis with all other solutions to drive down emissions between now and 2030. It doesn't create any conflict with food production or biodiversity loss. It captures both the carbon removal as well as the avoidance. And much of it is also at a huge economic opportunity. The report that Jonathan mentioned earlier actually singled out the economic opportunity of a sustainable land sector globally, and something like a net 2.3 trillion opportunity is there to be had, as well as this cost-effective climate mitigation opportunity. So 37%. Now, obviously, that then compares to the 3% of climate finance that it's currently receiving. So a huge gap that we see between the opportunity and how much of that opportunity is currently being realized. The other thing to say about natural climate solutions is what an incredible suite of other benefits they provide for people and the planet. And some of those are marked there. Conscious that I've only got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to pivot now to the COP, if that's okay. So if we know how big an opportunity natural climate solutions are, 37% of the opportunity, and we understand how they're ever more critical than ever to drive us towards net zero by mid-century, I'm going to talk a little bit about how important this COP is that's happening right now. And there are a number of elements that Jonathan outlined that will have an impact as to how much of that 37% is unleashed and how much of it is unleashed in a cost-effective way. But I'm going to focus on one of those that is, we think, particularly important, and that's the role of carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is one tool, of course, of many that we think can help bring private capital into natural climate solutions, but it's an increasingly important tool. This past year, we have seen businesses and governments increasingly stepping up and setting through net zero or other climate change reduction targets, commitments to purchase carbon offsets from the land sector at a scale that we haven't really seen before. Meanwhile, actually carbon pricing policy is now starting to embrace natural climate solutions, from the Colombia carbon tax, the existing California carbon market, the emerging China emissions trading scheme. And so what we have seen in this past 18 months is greater understanding of the awareness of these natural climate solutions, the role that they have to play, and that businesses and governments are starting to respond. Now, this COP and the Paris rulebook is really important because it will shape what essentially are the next generation of carbon pricing. What will carbon pricing look like for the coming decade? And so we're looking for a number of things from that rulebook. There are some areas within that are particularly of importance here, probably Article 6 on the market mechanisms and the transparency elements of the rulebook. And what we're looking for is clarity. But what we are looking for in that clarity is that we want that clarity to set enough of the rules so that that diversity is able to move forwards and the energy that's already been created can advance. What we don't want the rulebook to do is to sort of overstep its mark and in any way dampen or restrict this. So it needs to recognize what is now a very bottom-up world of climate action and set an umbrella around principles and parameters to enable all of that to move forwards. So, for example, we need robust accounting, but what's really critical there is that with this diversity of approaches, what we need to be able to see is clarity of accounting across and between those, so we can ensure that we're looking and making and comparing apples with apples. The same on the transparency side, so that we can see transparency across that diversity of actions. Two final things that we really want to see for the COP that are perhaps a little broader, but ultimately will inform how the COP delivers that next generation of carbon pricing as a tool to unlock natural climate solutions. One is you may see, or you may have seen in previous years, the land sector or natural climate solutions being or attempted to be singled out in one or other parts of the Paris rulebook. And we don't actually want to see that. That often creates challenges rather than attracting special preferential treatment. So if you see that, you might have cause for concern, and we would as well. And the other is just to re-emphasize the critical point that Jonathan raised. Ultimately, we know we're not on track to deliver net zero, and this has to also deliver a framework that is clear about how we're going to rapidly raise our collective ambition. So with that, back to Rebecca.
Thank you, Chris, very much for speeding through that when I'm sure there was endlessly more depth to what you could have said, so we really appreciate it. We've had quite a few questions coming in, but I want to start with one for both of you, which might be a little bit evil as a question, but don't, and obviously don't go in, I'm sure it's something you could talk about at length, but just a quick response from both of you. You've both talked in your presentations about your aspiration for unlocking private sector ambition and action. But can you tell us, have you got any sort of predictions for what you think might actually happen out of the next 2 weeks? What do you think might actually occur and be decided on? Should we go to Jonathan first?
Yes, a wicked question, Rebecca. Of course, it started already, and the signs are that actually it started off with quite a well-developed negotiating text. So I am expecting that a lot of the rule book, the principles, the bare bones of the rule book will be agreed in Katowice. And then remember, we've still got 2 years to go before we get to the implementation date. And then there will be a great deal of work yet to be done to add the kind of detail that makes that implementable. But from my perspective, remember I mentioned the Marrakesh Accords. Once those were written down and sort of scoped out, private sector finance started to flow into the Kyoto Protocol opportunities. And I'm hoping and expecting that the same thing will happen in Katowice. There'll be large gaps in what people hoped would be there, but there'll be enough to make business feel confident.
Thanks, Rebecca. Indeed, a wicked question. Luckily, I'm going to build on a lot of what Jonathan said and perhaps put it in a slightly broader framing. So I think this COP is really a test of a government's committed to making Paris work in practice. They've agreed it in theory, and this is about, are they committed to making it happen? And I think there are 3 things we're looking for here, one of which is finalizing the Paris rulebook that Jonathan talked of. The other is scaling ambition, that's come up a number of times already, improving their NDCs. And the third is commitments on finance. Finance maintains the grease that wheels this process. And that I think that on the scaling ambition and improving NDCs, the EU has recently moved towards stepping up its longer term ambition. The Marshall Islands in the last few months has stepped up with higher ambition. So we're seeing some movements there. I think with where the US is, it's all eyes on China. There are some rumors that China may be moving to scale up its ambition, whether they'll announce now or whether they'll announce in the next year. I think that's really critical. Jonathan also mentioned the Green Climate Fund. Germany pledged over €1 billion just before the COP to the Green Climate Fund. So commitments on finance, some positive movement. Actually, for us, where we're probably unlikely, I think, to see as much as we were hoping for is in the rulebook. As Jonathan says, I think we will leave that with technical gaps. That will mean that people can move forwards, but not quite with the pace and scale and confidence that we really need to unleash what the private sector can bring.
Thank you very much. And sort of following on from that, a question which was specifically for you, Jonathan, but Chris, feel free to pipe in also if you have a comment, which is how much the IPCC report, which, as Jonathan mentioned, pushed for 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees and referred to sort of rapid and unprecedented scale of change that is required, rapid being the key word. How much influence do you think the IPCC report will have on the attitudes and decisions that are made at this COP?
Thanks. I think it will make a big impact. I think for the first time, the IPCC has come forward with data that supports greater urgency, deeper transformation. I think we've seen companies like some of the big emitting companies already stepping up. Shell, for example, which has had its scenario work, which dealt a lot actually with nature-based solutions and drawdown to the recommendations that we made, have stepped up, going to publish their targets and their short-term targets. So I think already it's had an impact where it's needed to be. The bigger companies with the greater transformation of their capital assets are beginning to feel that it's time to act. How that translates into policy progress on the nitty-gritty and all those complexities, I'm slightly less optimistic about.
Thanks. The only other thing I would add is I think one of the great things that the IPCC did was, yes, it brought to bear a fantastic evidence base, but it also did a great job at communicating that, perhaps better than it ever has done. And one of the messages is that we only now have 5, maybe 10 years to tackle this. And I think that window and the challenge that lays is much shorter than has previously been in the minds of politicians and businesses. And I think that time frame starts to get politicians and businesses' attention because it's in their cycle of investments, or perhaps they can think, well, actually this is now something that will still be a challenge I need to deal with in my political career. And I think that has been a really good forcing mechanism. Like Jonathan, my reservations on the Paris rulebook are that I don't think it's going to quite yet trickle down into that technical nitty-gritty.
Great, thank you. So I think we've just got time. I've got 2 questions for you, Chris. I think we've got time for both of them. First of all is the 37%, the one number that you wanted us to remember from your presentation. Who do you think needs to get involved to realise that 37% opportunity?
Thanks for the question. Glad I had a few more times to plug the number so you can all remember it. Yeah, so that the 37% number, it will probably come as no surprise that we need everybody to lean into this. That some of those solutions have commercial outcomes that we think the private sector can take advantage of today. We and others are increasingly working, for example, with the forestry sector, looking at the role of sustainable reforestation at scale as a business model that's investable today. Some of it will require governments to create either the enabling environments or to ensure that the protection of lands, which doesn't deliver necessarily positive cash flows, can occur. So there's a role for public policy. Let us not also forget the vital role of indigenous peoples and forest communities, who are one of the largest global custodians of our forests around the world. And how do we engage and enable them to take a greater role in protecting their assets and livelihoods, community lands and spiritual lands. So the honest answer is it's going to need all of us.
Thank you. Another question for you, Chris. I think, and then yeah, another one has just popped up, but we'll see if we've got time for that. But the first question is, just scroll up a bit. So there are a number of accounting techniques out there with regard to natural capital accounting for renewables. How can the private sector be convinced to incorporate into decision-making those things into its decision-making, especially as part of their triple bottom line? So sort of similar question about specifically corporates and how can corporates be convinced to incorporate natural capital accounting into their decision-making?
Great, thank you for that question. Great question, and a topic I didn't get to touch on, so I'm glad it's come up. I think one of the things that businesses increasingly are understanding, and I think there are now many of the tools needed to do so, is to understand a company's dependencies on natural capital to deliver its business model, and on the opportunities nature provides to enhance its business model. So to give two examples, one on each of those sides. So probably it's 4 or 5 years ago, apologies if it's slightly longer, but Puma, the manufacturer of sports goods, produced the world's first environmental profit and loss account. And it looked at its impact and dependency across a number of sustainability metrics, one of which was land use. And what it found was when it compared land use and its dependency and impact on land use compared to water, waste was another one, I think, greenhouse gas emissions, it found that land use was the biggest dependency and sort of challenge within its business. And so I know that through initiatives like the Natural Capital Protocol, there are now tools to enable all businesses to understand that. Puma has since been taking huge action to help understand those dependencies, but obviously the first step is to understand what's in front of you. On the flip side of that, the other is a partnership that the Nature Conservancy has had with Dow Chemicals for a number of years, where we have been working with Dow to look at a number of their assets, so a lot of their sort of manufacturing and industrial plants around the world, and to help them think about how green versus grey infrastructure is not just better for conservation outcomes, but actually are more cost effective for them as commercial options to deliver their business and their business model in those situations. So there are tools out there. I'd certainly encourage people to look at the Natural Capital Protocol.
The mention of the protocol leads very nicely into a final question, which Jonathan, is just for you, just a quick response, even though I think it could be a really long response. But we understand how clarity and transparency are needed to get onto the net zero pathway. Are there any initiatives to build this? So yeah, initiatives to help support that sort of clarity and transparency of net zero or carbon neutral claims. You quickly talk about that.
Thank you for that last question. Actually, just picking up, Chris, you were talking about everybody having a role to play in terms of nature-based solutions. One of the things that I would mention is that the private sector has already sort of stepped up for those companies that are choosing net zero or carbon neutrality, using carbon credits from forest or ecosystem projects. And in our experience, there is already a lot of knowledge and guidance around carbon neutrality within organizations, supply chains and products. We've developed the carbon neutral protocol, for example, as one example of that, over the last 20 years or so, which develops very simple steps that organizations can take to account for their footprint, can take action on internal reductions, select and choose and retire carbon credits in order to compensate for unavoidable emissions, and communicate that. So with that with that one example, and I know you wanted to keep it quick, I'll probably leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I'm aware of the time. We're right on our 45 minutes. So just before, as I wrap up, I just want to mention a couple of things. Firstly is that as Jonathan mentioned, the 10 recommendations for the UNFCCC that were uncovered during the Talanoa discussions we held, you can find out more about those on our website, naturalcapitalpartners.com/Talanoa, and the rest of our Talanoa findings. Also on that, we're holding a webinar that specifically talks more about the findings from our Talanoa dialogues, and that will be held on February the 12th. So if you go to our website, you can register for that webinar, which will talk about the input that we had from businesses, those 61 businesses when we held those discussions. And if you are heading to COP, Jonathan will be there speaking at several events, including how to raise ambition under the Paris Agreement, avoiding double counting, that's an interesting topic that could go on for a while, and creating supply and demand to support a robust Article 6 implementation. So if you are going to be there, then please do go and find Jonathan, and we will be posting, Jonathan will be writing a blog when he returns from Poland, so we'll be posting the main things that he's picked up on in that blog in a week or so. With that, I'm going to end this webinar now. I'd like to thank all of you for your attendance, and the webinar recording will be available shortly on our website and sent to everyone who has attended, so you can share it with your colleagues. So thank you for that, and for everyone, as it's December, I think I can now say season's greetings to everyone who's listening. Thank you.